Hello, my name is Brant, and today is the 14th day of May 2020. And what I'm doing today is going to be reading from a book, a very short book. If you can read this, Natural Law by Lysander Spooner, which was written in 1882. Lysander Spooner was a true rebel in what we would call simply understanding that all men should be treated equally. And he was involved in many things at that point in his time, and unfortunately, most people don't even know who he is. But he wrote a few books that deal with natural law. So what I'm going to do today is going to be reading from this book. It's not that long, probably a little over 25 pages maybe, and we'll go from there so that people can understand it without having to buy a book, which you may not be able to get in the near future. So, especially a written book, a real book, as I would say. So here we go. Natural Law, Part 1, Chapter 1, The Science of Justice, Section 1, is dealing here. The science of mine and thine, the science of justice, is the science of all human rights, of all a man's rights of person and property, of all his rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the science which alone can tell any man what he can and cannot do, what he can and cannot have, what he can and cannot say without infringing the rights of any other person. It is a science of peace, and the only science of peace, since it is the science which alone can tell us on what conditions mankind can live in peace, or ought to live in peace with each other. These conditions are simply these, viz., first, that each man shall do towards each other all that justice requires him to do. As for example, that he shall pay his debts, that he shall return borrowed or stolen property to its owner, and that he shall make reparations for any injuries he may have done to the person or property of another. Another word for this would be restitution, making it right. The second condition is that each man shall abstain from doing to another anything which justice forbids him to do. As, for example, that he shall abstain from committing theft, robbery, arson, murder, or any other crime against a person or property of another. So long as these conditions are fulfilled, men are at peace and ought to remain at peace with each other. But when either of these conditions is violated, men are at war, and they must necessarily remain at war until justice is reestablished. Through all time, so far as history informs us, whenever mankind has attempted to live in peace with each other, both the natural instincts and the collective wisdom of the human race have acknowledged and prescribed as an indispensable condition obedience to this one and only universal obligation, viz., that each shall live honestly towards each other. The ancient maxim makes the sum of a man's legal duty to his fellow man to be simply this: to live honestly, to hurt no one, to give to everyone his due. This entire maxim is really expressed in the single words of to live honestly. Since to live honestly is to hurt no one and give to everyone his due. Section 2. Man, no doubt, owns many other moral duties to his fellow man, such as to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, protect the defenseless, assist the weak, and enlighten the ignorant. But these are simple moral duties, of which each man must be his own judge in each particular case as to whether and how far he can or will perform them. But of his legal duty, that is, of his duty to live honestly towards his fellow men not only may judge, but for their own protection must judge. And if need be, they may rightfully compel him to perform it. They may do this acting singly or in consent. They may do it on the instance as a necessity arrives, or deliberately and systematically if they prefer to do so, and the existence will admit of it. Section 3. Although it is the right of anybody and everybody, of any one man or set of men, no less than another, to repel injustice, and to compel justice for themselves and for all who may be wronged. Yet to avoid the errors that are liable to results from haste and passion, and that everybody who desires it may rest secure in the assurance of protection without a resort to force. It is evidently desirable that men should associate so far as they freely and voluntarily can do so, for the maintenance of justice among themselves and for mutual protection against other wrongdoers. It is also in the highest degree desirable that they should agree upon some plan or system of judicial proceedings which in the trial of causes should secure caution, deliberation through investigation, and as far as possible freedom from every interference but the simple desire to do justice. Yet such associations can be rightfully and desirably only insofar as they are purely voluntary. No man can rightfully coerce any to joining one or supporting one against his will. His own interests, his own judgment, and his own conscience alone must determine whether he will join this association or whether he will join any. If he chooses to depend for the protection of his own rights solely upon himself and upon such voluntarily assistance as to other persons may freely offer to him when the necessity for it arises, he has the perfect right to do so. And this course would be a reasonable, safe one for him to follow, so long as he himself should manifest the ordinary readiness of mankind, in like cases, to go to the assistance and defense of injured persons, and should also himself live honestly, hurt no one, and give to every one his due. For such a man is reasonably sure of always having friends and defenders enough in case of need, whether he shall have joined any association or not. This is a critical issue, is that today there are a few people who actually come to the aid of others who are actually being treated unjustly. This is where this is a big issue, and why we're in the state that we're in now and what's taking place in this country. Continue. Certainly no man can rightly be required to join or support an association whose protection he does not desire. Nor can any man be reasonably or rightfully expected to join or support any association whose plans or methods of proceedings he does not approve as likely to accomplish his purpose of maintaining justice, and at the same time itself avoid doing injustice. To join or support one that is in his opinion would itself do injustice, would be criminal. He must therefore be left at the same liberty to join or not to join association for this purpose as for any other, according to his own interest, discretion, or conscience shall dictate. Association for mutual protection against injustice is like association for mutual protection against fire or shipwreck, and there is no more right or reason to compelling any man to join or support one of these associations against his will, his judgment, or his conscience than there is in compelling him to join or support any other, whose benefit, if any, he does not want, or whose purpose or methods he does not approve. Section 4. No objection can be made in these voluntary associations upon the ground that they would lack that knowledge of justice as a science which would be necessary to enable them to maintain justice and therefore avoid doing injustice. Honestly, justice, natural law, is usually a very plain and simple matter, easily understood by by common minds. Those who desire to know what it is in any particular case seldom have to go far to find it. It is true it must be learned like any other science, but it is also true that it is very easily learned. Although as limited as its applications as the infinite relations and dealings of men with each other, it is nevertheless made up of a few simple elementary principles of the truth and justice which every ordinary mind has. An almost intuitive perception. And almost all men have the same perception of what constitutes justice or to what justice requires when they understand alike the facts from which their inference are to be drawn. Men living in contact with each other and having intercourse together cannot avoid learning natural law to a very great extent, even if they would. The dealings of men with men, their separate possessions and their individual wants, and the dispositions of every man and demand and insist upon whatever he believes to be his due, and to resist all invasions of what he believes to be his rights, are continually forced upon their minds the questions: is this act just, or is it unjust? Is this thing mine, or is it his? And these are questions of natural law, questions which in regard to the great mass of cases are answered alike by the human mind everywhere. Children learn the fundamental principles of natural law at a very early age. Thus they very early understand that one child must not, without just cause, strike or otherwise hurt another, that one child must not assume any arbitrary control or domination over another, that one child must not, either by force, deceit, or stealth, obtain possession of anything that belongs to another, that if one child commits any of these wrongs against another, it is not only the right of the injured child to resist, and if need be, punish the wrongdoer and compel him to make reparations, but that it is also the right and the moral duty of all other children and all other persons to assist the injured party in defending his rights and redressing his wrongs. These are fundamental principles of natural law, which govern the most important transactions of man with man. Yet children learn them earlier than they learn 3 plus 3 equals 6, or 5 and 5 equals 10. Their childish plays even could not be carried on without a constant regard to them, and it is equally impossible for persons of any age to live together in peace or any other conditions. It would be no extravagance to say that in most cases it is, if not at all, mankind at large, young and old, learn this natural law long before they have learned the meanings of the words by which we describe it. In truth, it would be impossible to make them understand the real meaning of the words if they did not first understand the nature of the thing itself. To make them understand the meanings of the word justice and injustice. Before knowing the nature of the things themselves would be as impossible as it would be to make them understand the meaning of the word heat and cold, wet and dry, light and darkness, white and black, and 1 and 2, before knowing the nature of the things themselves. Men necessarily must know sentiments and ideas, no less than material things, before they can know the meaning of the words by which we describe them. Chapter 2, The Science of Justice. Section 1. If justice be not a natural principle, it is no principle at all. If it not be a natural principle, there is no such thing as justice. If it be not a natural principle, all that men have ever said or written about it, from time immemorial, has been said and written about that which has no existence. It is by not a natural principle all the appeals for justice that have ever been heard and all the struggles for justice that have ever been witnessed have been appeals and struggles for a mere fantasy, a vagary of the imagination, and not for a reality. If justice be not a natural principle, then there is no such thing as injustice. And all the crimes of which the world has been the scenes have been no crimes at all, but only simple events, like the falling of the rain or the setting of the sun, events of which the victim had no more reason to complain than had to complain of the running of the streams or the growth of vegetation. If justice be not a natural principle, governments, so-called, have no more right or reason to take cognizance of it, or to pretend or profess to take cognizance of it, than they have to take cognizance or to pretend or profess to take cognizance of any other non-entity. And all their professions of establishing justice, or of maintaining justice, or of regarding justice are simply the mere gibberish of fools, or the frauds of impostors. We do have impostors all around us, don't we? But if justice be a natural principle, then it is necessarily an immutable one, and can no more be changed by any power inferior to that which established it, then can the law of gravitation, the law of light, the principles of mathematics, or any other natural law or principle whatsoever, and all attempts or assumptions on the part of any man or body of men, whether called themselves governments or by any other name, to set up their own commands, wills, and pleasure or discretion in the place of justice as a rule of conduct for any human being, are as much a absurdity, a usurpation, and a tyranny as would be their attempt to set up their own commands, wills, pleasure, or discretion in the place of any and all physical, mental, and moral laws of the universe. Section 2. If there be any such principle as justice, it is of necessity a natural principle, and as such is a matter of science, to be learned and applied like any other science, and to talk of either adding to or taking from it by legislation is just as false, absurd, and ridiculous as it would be a talk to adding to or taking from mathematics, chemistry, or any other science by legislation. Section 3. If there be in nature such a principle as justice, nothing can be added to or taken from its supreme authority by all the legislation which the entire human race united are capable, and all the attempts of the human race of any portion of it to add to or take from the supreme authority of justice, in any case whatsoever. It is no more obligation upon any since upon any single human being than it is the idle wind. Now, folks, we have so much legislation about so much stuff that just completely goes against all of what Lysander Spooner is talking about right now. Section 4. If there be such a principle of justice of natural law, it is a principle or laws that tell us what rights were given to every human being at his birth. What rights are, therefore, inherited in him as a human being, remains with him during life, and however capable of being trampled upon, are incapable of being blotted out, extinguished, annihilated, or separated, or eliminated from his nature as a human being, or deprived of their inherited authority or obligation. On the other hand, if there be no such principle as justice or natural law, then every human being came in the world utterly destitute of rights, and coming into a world destitute of rights, he must necessarily forever remain so. For if no one brings any rights with him into the world, clearly no one can ever have any rights of his own or give any to another. And the consequence would be that mankind can never have any rights. And for them to talk of any such thing as their rights would be to talk of things that never had, never will have, and never can have an existence. If there be such a natural principle as justice, if it's necessarily the highest, and consequently the only and universal law for all those matters to which it is naturally applicable, and consequently all human legislation is simple and always assumption of authority and dominion, where no right of authority or dominion exists. It is therefore simply and always an intrusion, absurdity, and usurpation, and a crime. On the other hand, if there be no such natural principle as justice, there can be no such thing as injustice. If there be no such natural principle as honesty, there can be no such thing as dishonesty. And no possible act of either force or fraud committed by one man or against a person or property of another can be said to be unjust or dishonest, or to be complained of or prohibited, or punished as such. In short, if there be no such principles as justice, there can be no such thing acts as crimes, and all the professions of government, so called, that they exist, either in whole or in part, for the punishment or prevention of crimes, are professionals that they exist for the punishment or prevention of what never existed, nor ever can exist. Such professions are therefore confessions that so far as crimes are concerned, governments have no occasion to exist, that there is nothing for them to do, and that there is nothing that they can do. They are confessions that the government exists for the punishment and prevention of acts that are, in their nature, simple and impossibilities. Section 6. If there be in nature such a principle as justice, such a principle as honestly, such principles that we describe by the words mine and thine, such principles as men's natural right to rights of person and property, then we have immutable and universal law, a law that we can learn as we learn any other science, a law that is paramount to and excludes everything that conflicts with it. A law that tells us what is just and what is unjust, what is honest and what is dishonest, what things are mine and what things are thine, what are my rights of person and property, and what are your rights of person and property, and where is the boundary between each and all of my rights of person and property, and each and all of your rights of person and property. And this law is the paramount law and the same law over all the world at all time and for all people, and will be the same paramount and only law at all times and for all people so long as man shall live upon the earth. But if on the other hand there be in nature no such principle as justice, no such principle as honesty, no such principle as men's natural rights of person or property, then all such words as justice and injustice, honesty and dishonesty, all such words as mine and thine, are words that signify that one thing is one man's property and that another thing is another man's property. All words that are used to describe man's natural rights of person and property, all such words as they are used to describe injuries and crimes, could be struck out of all human language as having no meaning, and it should be declared at once and forever that the greatest force and the greatest fraud for their time being are the supreme and only laws for governing the relationships of men with each other, and that from henceforth all persons and combinations of persons, those that call themselves governments, as well as all others, are to be left free to practice upon each other all the force and all the fraud of which they are capable. Section 7. If there be no science of justice, there can be no science of government, and all the capacity and violence by which in all ages and nations a few confederated villains have attained the mastery over the rest of mankind. reduced them to poverty and slavery. That's what's taking place right before us in the last 200 to 300 years here. Sorry, I had to interject that. And established what they call governments to keep them in subjection, have been as legitimate examples of governments as any that the world has ever seen. Section 8. If there be in nature such a principle as justice, it is necessity the only political principles there ever was or ever will be. All the other so-called political principles which men are in the habit of inventing are not principles at all. They are either the mere concepts of simpletons who imagine they have discovered something better than truth and justice and universal law, or they are mere devices and pretenses to which selfish and conniving men resort as means to get fame and power and money. Chapter 3. Natural law contrasts with legislation. Natural law, natural justice, being a principle that is naturally applicable and adequate to the rightful settlement of every possible controversy that can arise among men, being too the only standard by which any controversy whatever between man and man can be rightfully settled, being a principle whose protection every man demands for himself, whether he is willing to accord to it others or not, being also immutable principle, one that is always and everywhere the same in all ages and nations, being self-evidently necessary in all times and places, being so entirely impartial and equally towards all, so indispensably to the peace of mankind everywhere, so vital to the safety and welfare of every human being, being to so easily learned, so generally known, and so easily maintained by such voluntary associations as all honest men can readily and rightfully form for that purpose. Being such a principle as this, these questions arise. Why is it that it does not universally or well nigh universally prevail? Why is it that it has not, as ages ago, been established throughout the world as the one and only law that any man or all men could rightfully be compelled to obey? Why is it that any human being ever conceived that anything so evidently, superfluously false, absurd, and atrocious as all legislation necessitates could be of any use to mankind or have any place in human affairs? Section 2. The answer is that through all historical times, whenever any people have advanced beyond the savage state and have learned to increase their means of subsistence by the cultivation of the soil, a greater or lesser number of them have associated and organized themselves as robbers to plunder and enslave all others, who have either accumulated any property that could be seized or has shown by their labor that they could be made to contribute to their support or pleasure of those who should enslave them. These band of robbers, small in number at first, have increased their power by uniting with each other, inventing warlike weapons, disciplining themselves and perfecting their organization as military forces, as dividing their plunder, including their captives, among themselves, either in such proportions that have been previously agreed on, or in such as that the leaders, always desirous to increase the numbers of the followers, should prescribe. The success of these band of robbers was an easy thing, for the reason that those whom they plundered and enslaved were comparatively defenseless. Being scattered thinly over the country, engaged wholly in trying by rude intimates and heavy labor to extort assistance from the soil, having no weapons of war other than sticks and stones. The issue here, I'm sorry. Having no weapons of war other than sticks and stones, have no military discipline or organization, and no means of concentrating their forces or acting in concert when suddenly attacked. Under these circumstances, the only alternate left for them for saving even their lives or the lives of their family was to yield up not only the crops that they had gathered and the lands that they had cultivated, but themselves and their families also as slaves. Thenceforth, their fate was as slaves. Excuse me just a second here. Need a little bit of water. Thenceforth, their fate was as slaves to cultivate for others their lands that had been before cultivated for themselves. Being driven, constant to their labor, wealth slowly increased, but all went into the hands of the tyrants. These tyrants, living solely on plunder and on the labor of their slaves, applying all their energies to the seizure of still more plunder, and the enslavement of still other defenseless persons, increasingly too. Their numbers in perfecting their organization and multiplying their weapons of war. They extend their conquests until, in order to hold what they had already got, it became necessary for them to act systematically and cooperative with each other in holding their slaves in subjection. But all this they can do only by establishing what they call a government and making what they call laws. Bingo. Okay, tells you right there the governments are the thieves and robbers of others. All the great governments of the world, those that now existing, as well as those that have passed away, have been of this character. They have been merely band of robbers who have associated for the purpose of plunder, conquest, and enslavement of their fellow man. And their laws, as they have called them, have been only such agreements as they have found it necessary to enter into, or order to maintain their organizations and act together in plundering and enslaving others and securing to each his agreed share of the spoils. All these laws have had no more real obligation to have the agreements which brigades, bandits, and pirates find it necessary to enter into each other, for the more successful accomplishment of their crimes and the more peaceful division of their spoils. There's thus substantially all their legislation of the world has had its origins of desire of one class of persons to plunder and enslave others, and and hold them as property. Section 3. In process of time, the robber or slave owner class who had seized all the land had held all the means of creating wealth, beginning to discover that the easiest mode of managing their slaves and making them profitable was not for each slaveholder to hold his specific number of slaves, as he had done before, as he would hold so many cattle, but to give them so much liberty as would throw upon themselves, the slaves, the responsibility of their own subsistence, and yet compel them to sell their labor to the landholding class, their forming owners for just what the latter might choose to give them. Of course, these liberated slaves, some have it erroneously called them, having no lands or other property and no means of attaining independent subsistence, have no alternative to save themselves from starvation, but to sell their labor to the landholders in exchange only for coarsest necessity of life, not always for so much event at that. These liberated slaves, as they were called, were now scarcely less slaves than they were before. Their means of subsistence were perhaps even more precarious than than when each other had his own owner, who had an interest to preserve his life. They were liable, at the capricious interest of the landholder, to be thrown out of home, employment, and the opportunity of even earning a subsistence by their labor. They were therefore in large numbers driven to the necessity of begging, stealing, or starving, and become, of course, dangerous to the property and quiet of their late masters. The consequences was that these late owners found it necessary for their own safety and the safety of their property to organize themselves more perfectly as a government and make laws for keeping these dangerous people in subjection, that is, laws fixing the prices at which they should be compelling to labor, and also prescribing fearful punishment even death itself for such thefts and trespasses as they were driven to commit, as their own means of saving themselves from starvation. You see how they've done this? Making people dependent upon them. These laws have continued to force for hundreds and some centuries for thousands of years and are enforced today in greater or less severity as nearly all the countries of the globe. The purpose and effects of these laws have been to maintain in the hands of the robber or slave holding class a monopoly of all lands as far as possible, or all other means of creating wealth, and thus to keep the great body of laborers in such a state of poverty and dependence as would compel them to sell their labor to their tyrants for the lowest prices which life could be sustained. The results of all this is that there is little wealth there is in the world. It is all in the hands of the few. That is in the hands of the law-making slave-holding class, who are now as much slaveholders in spirit as they ever were, but who accomplish their purposes by means of the laws they made for keeping the laborers in subjection and dependence. And instead of each one owning his individual slaves, as so many shadow, thus the whole business legislation, which has now grown to such gigantic proportions, has its origins in the conspiracies which have always existed among the few, for the purpose of holding the many in subjection, and extorting from them their labor and all the profits of their labor. And the real motive and spirit which lie at the foundation of all legislation, notwithstanding all the pretenses and disguises with which they attempt to hide themselves, are the same today as they always have been. The whole purpose of this legislation is simple to keep one class of men in subordination and servitude to another. Section 4. What then is legislation? It is the assumption by one man or body of men of absolute irresponsible dominion over all other men, whom they can subject to their power. It is the assumption by one man or body of men of a right to subject all other men to their will and their service. It is the assumption by one man or body of men of a right to abolish outright all the natural rights, all the natural liberties of all other men, to make all other men their slaves, to arbitrarily dictate to all other men what they may or may not do, what they may and may not have, and what they may not be. It is, in short, the assumption of a right to banish the principle of human rights, the principle of justice itself, from off the earth and set up their own personal will, pleasure, and interest in its place. All this and nothing less is involved in the very idea that there can be any such thing as human legislation that's obligatory upon those upon whom it is imposed. So this is the completion of the book, Natural Law by Lysander Spooner. Sorry I had a little issue with pronouncing the words as I was trying to speedily get through this book in time. I thought it would take me about 30 minutes, and it's taking me about 38 minutes. So, but anyway, I would appreciate if you would share this with others and read it yourself or listen to it and learn how those who rule this country are in necessity, they're your slave owners. All right, have a great day. Thank you for listening.